The Bush Cook. Jack Black was forever messing around in the kitchen. He was our hut mate and served on the Riverina station as gardener, odd job expert and left-hand man to any scheme that the manager had going. His work filled in the time. His first and only love was the kitchen. He dreamt constantly of a career as a chef. The pinnacle of his fantasy was the Shamrock Hotel in Balredald. This was about the biggest establishment known to his fairly limited experience. That was Mecca. But he would cheerfully settle for being third offsider to a shearer's cook. Meanwhile, he insisted on exercising his talents by catering for the hut. Ken, my mate, and I found that hunger makes you tolerant of what passes as tucker. Jack was known in the vernacular as being a few bob short of the full quid. We found him most of the time to be friendly, cheerful and a good workmate. When suitably provoked, however, he was prone to a violent rage. The only sensible tactic was to disappear until the tension died down. I suppose we ragged Jack a little. It helped to pass the time. He didn't mind if reasonable limits were observed, and he had a win himself occasionally. He nearly had a big win with his preserves. Somebody had given him a bag of horse carrots. Jack had diligently abstracted the doubtful ones and started serving up the rest. After a few days, a carrot diet, boiled, baked and raw, began to strain the friendship. Following some discussion, the carrots disappeared and we resumed a fairly normal menu. What we didn't know was that Jack, with only the most rudimentary knowledge of food preserving, had put these aside for future use. He'd boiled them, loaded them into a few empty pickle jars, sealed the jars with newspaper and string, and stored them in a handy cupboard. They'd been sitting there in the dark, quietly fermenting for some weeks. He served them up in a sort of casserole. Fortunately, even with strong gravy and lashings of sauce, the telltale metallic flavour was not disguised. We gave the main course to the lean and hungry station dogs. But they wouldn't touch the carrots. Jack showed no remorse. A little disaster now and then only added to his enthusiasm. We'd been pulling his leg for a couple of days over some scones that he'd produced. They turned out like wet clay. He was showing the familiar signs of irritation, and we were waiting warily for his revenge. This usually took the form of a general strike, always of remarkably short duration. When only to bugger up the next meal, and with much abuse, Jack would resume normal duties. "You can't even boil bloody water," he'd claim. "You'd flamin' starve if it weren't for me." We'd say nothing. Our heads hung in shame and attended to the washing up. It was, I suppose, after 9 on a wet and windy night. The three of us were huddled in front of the big wood fire stove. We'd been talking about this and that, nothing contentious, and having an occasional port. Jack had been very quiet, and this in itself was not unusual. He got to his feet and announced that he was going out to howl at the moon. This was an old saying, and his euphemism for relieving the bladder. Jack made his way to the door and went out. Just as he closed the door, the stove exploded with an enormous roar. We were flung backwards out of our chairs. The doors on our old cast-iron cooker and other fittings and cooking gear left it for some other place. I managed a sincere, heartfelt expletive. Bloody hell! The room was black. Jack's 2 old hurricane lamps had been a casualty of the explosion. The air was thick with the accumulated dust and soot of many years, and Ken was caught in a coughing fit. Between gasps and gags, he managed, "The mad bastard! He's put a bomb in the bloody stove." We fell over most available obstacles, some of them twice, and finally found the door. It was locked. The door opened outwards and had a sizable padbolt for when the hut wasn't being used. Our mate, obviously a little disturbed, had bolted the door. "Open this bloody door, Jack, or I'll punch your bloody head in." Ken sounded agitated. "Go easy," I said. "Give him time to think it through." Be buggered. What if there's another bomb somewhere? This was the point. What other mischief could our old mate have got up? Life, it seemed, was full of surprises. "Listen, boys," the voice was plaintive. "I'll open the door if yous promise not to shoot me." We could hear him mumbling to himself. Then, a little louder, he adopted the aggrieved tone we know so well. "Oh, stuffed if I know what I'm supposed to have done. And some blokes try and kill me. It's not fair. Geez, I don't know what I might have done." I tried to sound conciliatory. "Come on, Jack, we'll sort it out, okay? Nobody's going to shoot you." Ken whispered, "Not right a bloody way." "Just open the door, Jack. She'll be right." He pulled the bolt and we stepped out into the fresh air. I got a torch from the car and we began a post-mortem. The kitchen was a mess. Soot covered just about everything. It would take a day to clean it up. On Jack's insistence, we shook hands all round several times and took the decision that nothing more could be achieved that night. Next morning, I called on Bob, the manager, early. I said that we'd had some problem with the stove and that with one thing and another, we'd like the morning off. He looked a bit puzzled and offered to come down to help, but I managed to put him off the idea. When I got back to the hut, Ken and Jack were examining the door. Jack had been explaining his side of the story. It took a while to get the thing straight, but eventually we got to something coherent. Jack had gone out the door, pushed it to, then stood for a moment with his back to it, getting his eyes accustomed to the dark. Suddenly, he heard a violent explosion, which could only have been a shotgun, and he was knocked to the ground. With his outraged mind going at the speed of light, he realised that we'd bungled his murder. The door had taken the impact, not his back. His only hope now was to lock us in. Then as his thoughts slowed down, he could work out his next moves. His pendulum had swung from disbelief to thoughts of revenge. The door locked, and our delay in sorting ourselves out inside let him reach an optimistic conclusion. Having attempted his murder and failed, he thought we were unlikely to try again. "We're real good mates, aren't we?" When he explained this in his guileless manner, I couldn't help thinking that he had taken Christian charity to a new height. He was quite emotional when we finally convinced him that there had been no shotgun, no blast at the door, and no thoughts of homicide. It called for further handshakes all round and much talk of being mates for life. "After all, Jack," Ken said, "your cooking's not quite that bloody bad, mate." The sensible light of day had served to dispel the bomb theory, but it took a little detective work to find a solution. Amongst the debris was Jack's favourite baking dish. This was an old battered homemade affair at about 15 inches square by about 4 inches deep, made from heavily gauged metal. It bore the blackened stains of 10,000 meals. Normally it resided on a table on the veranda with a bag thrown over it. "What's the bacon dish doing here, Jack?" "Oh, I brung it in. Caught one of the dogs licking the fat." "Where'd you put it?" "In the oven." "Yeah, I reckon to be safe there." "You have much fat in it?" "Yeah, about half full or more." "Why?" "That's our bomb." Ken looked pleased with himself. "See, it would have boiled. We had the stove stoked up since 5. Pretty hot too. The fat boils to a gas, fills the oven, fills behind in the gap in the brickwork and just about everywhere else too. Eventually it reaches the firebox. Bit of a draft when Jack went out the door, and wham! That was a coincidence though. She must have been just about ready to go, I reckon, anyway. We did a thorough tidy up. We knew what to expect after lunch. We each won a bit of work well away from the hut. This was to give Bob plenty of time to give it the once-over. He found nothing to worry about, and we kept the story to ourselves for months. Time passed in peaceful fashion, and the weather improved. Jack's cooking may have improved too, or perhaps we were just beyond caring. There was more to life than eating anyway. Jack's finest hour came a few months later. He had planned a roast dinner for one Sunday afternoon. The day was hot and dry and lazy. Our Sunday chores were finished by 10 o'clock. These consisted mainly of a ritual known as turning the mattress and washing socks. The latter involved putting several pairs of socks on and walking on the spot in a trough of soapy water. The socks were later hung in a state of rigor mortis on the barbed wire fence surrounding the hut. I worked through mine on an organised rotation, which I'm pleased to forget. Ken had he could sort of put it on, from either end. We had a large leg of mutton Jack had saved from the meat issue of the week. It had belonged to some rangy, overgrown, geriatric merino wether. Any leftovers from our proposed feast would make good sandwich filling. Lately, this had all alternated, between butter and sugar and butter and tomato sauce. Other than an acknowledgement at intervals of Jack's diligence and our profound delight at the forthcoming meal, there was little to do. At last, with a fine flourish, Jack said we could sit up, shut up, and eat up. Jack had done a right royal job. There was a roast leg sitting on his notorious baking dish, baked potatoes and onions, and a tin of cold canned peas. Bread and butter were standing by. We tumbled to it. Jack insisted on serving. His carving was a little rugged, but at least it was generous. Several lumps of meat, 2 potatoes, and an onion each, and a couple of tablespoons of peas. We were loud in our praise, and Jack preened himself and blushed like a girl. Silence ensued. A meal like this is serious business. I was concentrating on reducing a large chunk of meat and fat to a manageable size when Ken kicked my uncle. "Friends on the plate, cobber." The light in the hut was not at all that good, even at midday, so I lifted my plate to examine it. Sure enough, there were about a dozen little workers moving around restlessly. I put the plate down and shifted my attention to the baked potato and onion. Unfortunately, Jack had caught the action. He struck a match over his own plate and began cursing. It was pretty repetitive stuff, but straight from the heart. Ken was silent and looking thoughtful. "I'll chuck the bloody lot out." Our chef was becoming upset. "Don't waste it," said Ken. "Give us your plate." Ken winked at me, took the plate and divided the meat and vegetables between us. "You'll have the peas, Jack?" "Yes, Jack will have the peas." Jack loved tin peas. He ended up with all 3 serves. Ken, saying nothing, began his work through the meal with obvious enjoyment. I could only follow his lead. Jack began, between mouthfuls of peas, was giving us the benefit of a vitriolic monologue. In his humble opinion, we were a pair of hungry, hopeless scavenger mongrels. This was repeated with small variations throughout the meal. Reference was made to the fact that anyone who would eat unadulterated food wasn't fit company for a good cook, such as himself. I looked at my plate, empty except for a couple of pea juice where my little friends were learning to swim. Ken's plate was the same as mine. It really had been a tasty feed. Somebody had to be wrong. Ken lit his fine cut and exhaled carefully. The meat was good, Jack. Too hot for these little sods. You opened the peas a little early. Go on, have a look in the tin." Our chef snatched up the tin and made for the door. One glance was enough to convince him. The tin hit the wall behind us. Jack followed and almost made it to the table when he wheeled about, crashed through the opening and draped himself over the gate. I remarked to Ken that a brisk walk was a fine thing after a big meal. He agreed, so we repaired over the dry creek to Roy's hut. We sat in the sun, smoking and swapping lies with Roy. We could hear Jack talking loudly to the Lord and throwing things about 2 or 3 hours. All was quiet when we finally went back about dusk. Jack had found my couple of bottles of port and emptied them. He was snoring heavily. Being a chef can be an exhausting business. Ken picked up the carving knife that Jack had let slip from his fingers. Without further debate, we gathered our rifle, the axe, and a tomahawk and locked them in the boot of the old chef. Jack had a massive hangover in the morning. We won the catering by default for 2 or 3 days. Then we got Mrs. Walker, the manager's wife, to buy a couple of recipe books, which we presented to him in a brief but very emotional ceremony. Not long after, we learned from the mailman that Grascott's team was looking for a cook's off-sider. We saw the contractor and told him about Jack. Ken said to him, "I know your cook. Jack would suit him fine. Just keeping his smart ass like me mate and I away from him, and he'll be the best cook's man you've ever had." He was right, of course. Jack stayed with Frank and the team for years.